さあ、手加減はなしや。思いっきりいくで、キリュウちゃんや。最年限夢のがあるね。欲しいドースで昨日より10高い。場所へ流れやすけ姿。
The relationship between video games and their stories is an interesting one. Pretty much every game has some kind of story to it, but unlike other forms of media such as fictional TV and movies, where story is pretty much the driving force, games have a much looser relationship with their stories. Many game stories being summarized in a line or two of dialogue just to provide context for the game, some having so little story it's left to nothing but implication from setting and the gameplay itself. With the growth in technology over the past few decades, resulting in games' ever-evolving graphical capabilities, games with more emphasis on story have become wildly popular, sometimes at the detriment to the core gameplay itself, creating an experience more akin to an interactive movie than a story-driven game, and many more that blur the lines in between. Whatever your preferred genre may be, everyone can appreciate a good story, and while many games have managed to excel in both gameplay and storytelling elements, there's one aspect of most game stories I feel, while a force paramount to driving our protagonists through their adventure, is simultaneously often glossed over: the villain. Even early games with the most basic of stories have villains, like Mario's Bowser or Zelda's Ganon. Some are a little more fleshed out, with dialogue, while others remain silent. All serve little more purpose than to give our heroes something to fight against. In essence, they're a physical, vanquishable form of evil and nothing more. We don't really know them. We often know nothing of what really motivates them beyond the shallow, vapid tropes of power or wealth. We don't know why they took an evil path to achieve their goals, when they often live in a world where power and wealth is fairly easily achievable through good. Essentially, we don't really know why they are evil. We just know that they are. However, in a time of simplicity, these games often featured equally simple protagonists. Good guys who are good because, well, somebody needed to do it. The further in time we progress, however, protagonists become more and more fleshed out, often with detailed backstories, friends, families, dreams and fears, but this same treatment is rarely afforded to their villainous counterparts. In fact, most of the problem, I feel, lies within the fact that once we see someone as evil, we stop seeing them as a person altogether. We struggle to believe that anyone who could do so much bad could have any redeeming qualities. Also, unlike good qualities, which often take time and effort to really portray, villainy can fairly easily be boiled down to a simple cutscene that lasts a few seconds. While villains often lack any good qualities, protagonists, on the other hand, don't always have to be fully good. They can be a little rough around the edges as long as their heart is in the right place. In short, they don't have to be the opposite of their evil counterpart, as long as they are opposed to what the villain themselves is doing. Not only does this give so much more breathing room to play around with different kinds of protagonists, while villains are often reduced to nothing more than a set of tropes, but we are put in a position where we are, by default, biased towards the hero. We might even hate them for everything that they are, but hey, at least they aren't as bad as the other guy. Now, by no means am I trying to claim there are no well fleshed out villains in video games, but I do, however, feel they are much more of a rarity. While protagonists are made to feel relatable, villains feel as if they are often made just to look cool. Rarely do I feel any sort of emotion after taking down a final boss other than satisfaction. Often, just like the hero, I feel no remorse for the life that I just ended. Basically, if protagonists were an expensive alcohol, most villains would be supermarket own brand. And in my early experiences of the Yakuza series, the infamous Goro Majima was no exception. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm on my own here. But I adore when a story makes my morality hang in the balance. I enjoy plots that really make me think over just telling me that side A is good and side B is not. I understand why often a villain's humanity is locked away from the audience. The more you humanize a bad guy, the harder it really is to believe he's all that evil. It's a hard balance to strike, and I can see why in many stories it's not touched upon all that frequently. I find it a shame, however, in a day and age where story-heavy games are so popular, for the development to be so one-sided. Needless to say, it's extremely refreshing to see a villain not only receive a proper backstory, but an entire game dedicated to telling it. Now granted, I should briefly explain my personal experiences with the Yakuza series before I continue, and state that this video does contain light spoilers. While it's your choice to continue watching or not, I should however mention that the original Yakuza came out in 2006, and its existence essentially spoils Yakuza 0. Anything involving in-depth spoilers I will give you fair warning of. When Yakuza first appeared on store shelves, I was 12 years old, and at that point in my life, while I very much enjoyed gaming, I thought it more a hobby than a passion. I was much more inclined to go after the next brightly coloured action platformer than what I mistakenly thought to be a violent Japanese GTA clone. It wasn't until a few years later, when gaming had taken over a much more substantial chunk of my life, that I stumbled across a YouTube video where someone mentioned Yakuza in a very positive light, and I felt myself compelled to pick it up. Sadly, I never did end up finishing the game. While I'm often not fussy with going back to older games, the graphically impressive Yakuza came at the cost of frequent, fairly long load screens, and it did make my teenage self lose interest. But not before I learnt the name Goro Majima. There wasn't anything at the time I found especially stand out about Majima as a whole. I did appreciate he was more of an anarchist than a typical villain, acting to Kiryu as the Joker does to Batman, and not so coincidentally voiced by Mark Hamill. He's not the big bad guy, and he's not on their side, but he's also not on your side. From the impression I got at the time, to me Majima came across as a fairly well-designed, well-acted, generic villain. So earlier this year, after a late-night YouTube binge, I gave in to temptation and dipped my foot back into the Yakuza pool, starting with Yakuza 0. I thought if I was going back, it would be smart to start with a prequel, and I'm glad that I did. It wasn't till I unpacked my copy of the game and was greeted with a very familiar eye-patch-clad scowl that memories of who Majima was came flooding back. Diving into said pool, I was pleasantly surprised and fairly instantly pulled in by the story and the world of KAZUMA Kiryu, racing through story missions before binging on racing of a different kind. I was so wrapped up that upon reaching Chapter 3, I was quite taken aback by the abrupt change in scenery as Goro Majima entered the stage. I'd become so invested in what I was doing with Kiryu that I'd all but forgotten the game centered around not one but two main characters. Mildly annoyed, I sat through the opening 20-minute cutscene and was shocked to be greeted not by a depraved, anarchistic lunatic, but a cool, calm, and very suave-looking Majima. Not only is this perhaps one of the most badass character intros I've seen, but the difference from old Majima is night and day. No, it's not unheard of, nor is it uncommon for a villain to start off as a good guy before effectively falling from grace. It's another archetype we often see. A villain loses a loved one, is betrayed, or goes through some type of trauma which warps and corrupts a once gentle soul. It's a classic backstory if they're afforded one at all. There was now a part of me that suddenly felt eager to find out what Majima's downfall was. I quickly proceeded to roam the streets of Sotenbori, trying to find the answer to this now burning question. Taking every side quest I could, mastering the dance floor, beating my karaoke high score, and eventually taking the time out of my busy schedule to manage Club Sunshine and build myself a small empire. The problem was, the more I went on, the more I began to forget about finding the reason for Majima's madness. A new, more unnerving realization began to creep up on me. It wasn't because I'd lost interest in the story, it was because I didn't want Majima to become evil. Majima had grown on me, not just because he's this suave, street-smart badass, but because I actually felt pretty empathetic towards him. I saw how much of a raw deal he'd gotten, besides the fancy nightclub of course, and I grew a respect for how well he kept a lid on things, not through scheming or violence, but by being a very calm, diplomatic individual, something I would struggle to be if I were in his shoes. His subtle quirks, his straightforward nature, his compassion, his rigid morals that he follows to a T, the guidance he's willing to give to others, his sense of humor, and even his beautifully hilarious karaoke fantasy of a hollow-suited roller skate-wearing pop star version of himself, all play into how much of an interesting character this guy really is. It would have been so easy to write him off as a sort of hot-tempered loose cannon who got burned and was looking for a way to deal with it. And with the dilemmas he faces early, it would have been easy to see him act out selfishly. Instead, we watch him weigh up the morality of the situation, struggling with the idea of putting his desires before the needs of others. The game had done something I so rarely get to experience. It had made Majima, a villain, feel human. I realised how many times I'd chuckled along to the numerous bizarre situations he'd gotten himself into, or how I had felt the nail-biting tension whenever a difficult situation arose, and how I now realised I was rooting for the wrong team. So incredibly rare is it to not only find a well-written villain, but one who is so relatable I actually found myself wanting them to win. Granted, I don't mean to put down the writing of the other half of the story. It's beyond satisfying to watch them come together to make a whole. But Majima's side, however, blew my expectations out of the water. So much so that after an emotional roller coaster of events, I found myself surprisingly dreading the ending. No longer did I want to see what it was that broke Goro Majima. In fact, I wanted him to succeed. I wanted to play another game where good guy Majima patrolled the streets of Sotenburi. I wanted the guy who I had seen work so hard to be rewarded for his efforts. I wanted Mad Dog Majima to be the hero. When I finally begrudgingly left my Sotenburi life behind and headed to Kamurocho for my finale, I felt uneasy. And during the game's final events, I was utterly floored by what took place. So easily could they have picked any moment to break the real Majima free of his heroic shell that, as the events transpired and it didn't happen, not only did I become more intrigued, but also more on edge. Just how big was his downfall going to be? How far would they make him fall? How much better of a human being could they possibly make him before the madness took hold? And what I got in the end was, well, nothing like what I had expected. This next bit of the video will be focusing on the ending cutscenes, and as such I will leave you guys a timestamp if you want to skip over that segment of the video to avoid spoiling the story for yourself. See, what was so great for me about the ending to Yakuza 0 is that they had placed Majima up on a pedestal for me by this point, and it could be so easy to pick any moment to tear him down. In fact, I can think of multiple situations that would have broken me as a person, particularly confronting the person who is essentially responsible for all the hardships I've endured and still being able to walk away with the moral high ground. Doing the right thing, even if it's not what I really wanted to do. So rare is it to see a character like Majima do anything of the sort, because it's only after all the main events have played out that Majima really starts to slip into the Majima we all know. It's not a dramatic change either, visuals aside, it's slow. He starts to let go of the people he cares about, shown perfectly in one of the final cutscenes where he lets Makoto go rather than telling her who he is and how he feels. In fact, I think it's why I love this closing cutscene so much. He has a watch belonging to her that she said was a good luck charm, however it no longer chimes. Having been in possession of this watch through most of the events of the game, when all is said and done, he has it fixed and returns it to the empty lot where Makoto is sure to find it. But as we fade to black, the next thing we see is a very familiar looking, slightly deranged Majima. The juxtaposition between these two scenes is the moment I'd been searching for since the beginning of Chapter 3. This is the moment Majima goes mad. Not by some big traumatic turn of events, but by the simple act of returning a watch, a symbol of luck for Makoto, and for Majima, a symbol of letting go. The implication that Majima's mad dog nature is something that grew over time, rather than him being born evil or going insane as a result of trauma, is a testament to how well written he really is. He wasn't born a villain, nor was he made one. He chose to become one. For you see, so often do we pretend that the nature of being evil creates beings that live in a different world to us, like they are born or made differently. We don't like to think that one of us could make a conscious decision to become one of them. We like to believe that to be bad is to do bad, and that a bad person can do no good. We essentially like to take away a villain's humanity to make them more digestible. So watching a character like Majima is difficult because we spend so much time with him, seeing the world from his perspective, that it would almost be easier to see that moment where he snaps and turns to the other side. That way we can cast blame on the situation. Instead, we watch someone we helped come so far make a conscious decision to give up caring, to let go of the good side of them and spare themselves the emotional headache. Not only can we begin to understand his reckless nature, but we might even feel ourselves beginning to sympathize. Unlike most villains who we are led to believe lost or never had these human traits to begin with, we are forced to realize that someone like Majima shares these same feelings of compassion, hurt, fear, happiness, and sadness as we do. These traits that make us human. He just chooses to ignore them. He is in essence but a hair's width from Kiryu, separated by only a singular choice. He is a villain who chose to be evil, and that is something truly terrifying. Thank you so much for watching until the end. This is a totally new kind of video for me. I want to say a huge thanks to Devleon7 who graciously provided me with all this glorious Yakuza footage to use. I wouldn't have been able to get anything as nearing the quality of his footage, so big thank you to him. Thank you so much for helping me make this. Definitely go and give his channel a look if you are a fan of Yakuza. And yeah, until next time guys, take care and have a wonderful day.